For the last couple of lessons, we've been working with solving some simple or one-step equations. So we started with the idea of equations that have adding or subtracting, and that's where we introduced the idea of rearranging the equation to get the variable by itself so you can figure out what it is. And then we talked about how to undo equations that have multiplying. So we can use the same idea of doing things on both sides of the equation to keep it balanced and undoing and rearranging to undo multiplying. So we can undo equations with adding, subtracting, multiplying, which leaves us with one operation left, and that's dividing. So we're going to talk about that in this lesson, talk a little bit about how do you undo an equation with division. So we've got this idea of opposite operations going on. So we undo adding with subtracting, we undo subtracting with adding, because those are opposite operations, they undo each other. In the last lesson, we introduced the idea that you can undo multiplying with dividing, because multiplying and dividing are opposite operations. So similar idea is going to work if you have dividing in an equation. The way you would undo dividing is by multiplying. But if you multiply, you have to multiply both sides of the equation to keep your equation balanced. So that's that idea that got introduced when we first started working with this a couple lessons ago. So to solve an equation where a variable is being divided, undo the division by multiplying both sides of the equation. So we're going to look at a simple example of that, and then we're going to look at a couple of problems that have things that you need to watch out for with division equations so you don't get tricked by it. So we're going to look at a couple of extra problems so you can see, well, if it looks like this, what do I do? So the way we undo division is by multiplying. So multiplying both sides. So this first problem is a basic example of that. So in an equation, a lot of times we write division in a certain way. We like to use what's called a division bar, which is this little bar right here, to write division. So if you see something that's x over 4, that's the same thing as x divided by 4. We're just writing it with a division bar instead of a division symbol. So it's an alternate way that we can write division. And a lot of times in equations, you'll see it written this way with the bar instead of the division symbol, just because it's a little more efficient to write it that way. So this problem is saying x divided by 4 equals 12. Well, we know that multiplying undoes dividing, so if we want to rearrange this to get the x by itself, we could undo the divide by 4 by multiplying by 4. But if I multiply one side, I have to multiply the other side, and you should be literally writing it out twice on your paper to show that you understand this is happening twice. It's happening on both sides of the equation. So it should look kind of like what I just put down. So on this side, the multiply by 4 and the divide by 4, those are just going to cancel each other out. So it's going to leave us with the equation rearranged with x by itself. But on the other side, we also had to multiply by 4. So 12 times 4. And that's going to give us 48. So that means that x is 48. And we could check that if we go back to the original problem, because the problem is supposed to be x divided by 4 is 12. Well, x is 48, so 48 divided by 4 really does equal 12. So that means that is the correct answer. So that is the basis of how you undo dividing. You multiply. Now, there are a couple of twists in there that I want to talk about so that you know about, well, what if it looks like this? What is this telling me to do? So you might see some equations that look like this. So this looks like a negative 1/5 times x. So the thing you have to realize when you multiply by a fraction with a 1, 1/5, if you think about fractions, literally means 1 out of 5 pieces. So another way of finding 1/5 of something is to divide it into 5 pieces. So 1/5 is the same as dividing by 5. 1/3 is dividing by 3. 1/4 is dividing by 4. So whenever you have a fraction that's 1 over something, that's another way of saying just divide. So this negative 1/5 x, we could rewrite as x divided by negative 1/5 is the same thing as dividing it into 5 pieces, but it is negative, so divided by negative 5. So you could rewrite the equation that way. So we'll save that part for the actual equation. But yeah, so negative 1/5, and I just realized that our x went missing from this. You could squeeze it in. Negative 1/5 x and squeeze it in right there. It's the same as x divided by negative 5. So multiplying by 1/5 is the same as dividing by 5. And in this case, it's a negative, so we just keep the negative there. So I'm going to take this problem and I'm actually going to rewrite that. So whenever you see a fraction like that, you can change that to division. So divide by whatever the denominator of the fraction is. So I can change this into x divided by negative 5 equals negative 3. And now it's just like the problem that I did above. I would undo the division by negative 5 by multiplying by negative 5. So I would multiply by whatever number I'm dividing by to undo it. So I can multiply by negative 5, but if I multiply, I have to multiply on both sides to keep it balanced. So the division multiplication is just going to wipe out the division. On the other side, I have to be careful with my negatives. I'm going to end up with negative 3 times negative 5. And we know from our integers that if the numbers have the same sign, the answer is positive. So negative times negative is positive. So negative 3 times negative 5 is going to give me positive 15. So that would be my answer. Okay. So coming back over here, if you have a fraction, and so multiplying, we're going to kind of add a little note, and I want you to add this in here too. So multiplying by 1 over a number, whatever that number is, call it a number, is the same as dividing by the number. So that's really the trick we use there. So that's a division trick to remember. So if I had, 1/7 times x, that's the same as x divided by 7. So you can rewrite it as division so that you don't have that fraction in there gunking things up. So that's one thing that really is a division problem in hiding. You just have to recognize it so you don't get tricked by it. Now there's one other thing to be aware of when you are dividing. So, and you talked about the adding and subtracting equivalent of this when we talked about adding and subtracting, and we talked about how sometimes we've got like a negative sign in front of the number. So in this case we have a negative x. So that can be a little bit tricky because that makes it hard to figure out what x is when it's got a negative sign stuck in front of it. So I want to talk about how to deal with that if that happens to you. So if you saw a problem kind of like this. So that's kind of the last piece we're going to talk about. So in this guy, this would start out just like normal. So x, even though it's got a negative sign in front of it, it is being divided by 3. So the way we undo dividing equation is by multiplying. So I would start this off. I'm going to kind of ignore the negative for just a minute, and I'm going to multiply by 3 on both sides to undo the division. So multiplying and dividing are going to undo each other, and it's going to leave this x, but that x is still going to have a negative in front of it. So we'll deal with that in just a second. So negative 11 times 3 is negative 33. So now here's the thing you have to remember, and this is where we're actually going to put into play some other things that we talked about. So negative x is really, in algebra, how you really want to think about that is negative 1x, or negative 1 times x. So that negative is kind of a code word for a negative 1 in algebra. So when we say negative x equals negative 33, this is really a negative 1x equals negative 33. So we undid the division, but this actually has a second step to it. In order to figure out what x is, we've got to get rid of that negative 1 that's stuck to the x. So this comes back to the last lesson where we learn how to undo multiplying. Well, we undo multiplying by dividing. So if you're, done adding, subtracting, undoing your division, whatever, and you're left with something like this, if you just remember that that's really a negative 1x, we can undo that negative 1x or negative 1 times x by just dividing by negative 1, because multiplying and dividing undo each other. So if that ever happens to you, because it happens in lots of different equations, that's how you can undo it. So negative divided by negative is positive. So negative 33 divided by negative 1 would just be 33. So that would be our final answer. So what you're going to do is you're going to practice some dividing equations today. So your assignment is going to have a mix of different problems, kind of like the ones we're looking at. So you'll have some kind of like our first example that are just straight undo the division. You'll have some that are division problems, but they're written in fraction form, and you have to rewrite it to figure out, what am I actually dividing? So kind of like the second problem. And then you'll have a couple of problems in there where you have a negative stuck on the x. So if you have a negative stuck on the x, that third example will give you some ideas of how to deal with that. So with that done, you should be ready to go ahead and give today's assignment a try. So when your notes are all filled out and you're ready to go, then you can move on to that assignment.